Welcome, my name is Terry Soul, and this is Programming Chaos, a channel devoted to fun and interesting programming projects to help you hone your programming skills. In today's video, I'm going to be doing the third part of our evolutionary artificial life model. So if you haven't watched the two preceding videos, I highly recommend you do that. They're linked up above. In the first video, we created the environment that our evolving creatures are going to exist in. And you can see here it consists of a mixture of land and water, so fairly simple, just two types of terrain. And then there are food sources on land and food sources in water. And we can zoom in, that was part of that first video. And around each food source, there is a bit of what we can think of as scent. And that's going to help our creatures hone in on the food by detecting them through scent. And then in the second video, we started to program the creatures, so you can see them moving around here. And there's another one. Use our arrow keys to sort of look around on our map and find some other creatures. They're very simple, just sort of ovals with different appendages. So for example, a tail or some legs. And those affect how fast they move on land or water in our current model. And the behavior and those appendages and the other features of the creatures are defined by genes in their genome. So when we created the creatures, we gave them a fairly, extremely simple genome that defines how they look. And in today's video, we'll be adding into that how they behave. So right at the moment, based on those first two sort of programming project videos, we created an environment and we created these simple creatures that don't eat yet and don't evolve yet. So those are the two things we need to do. Let's start with the eating part so that when they move over food, like this one just did, they actually take advantage of that and gain some energy. So in the update function, what I want to do is begin by just calling an eat function that I have to define. And then because we're now starting to worry about energy balance, I also want to remove some energy when they move. So I need to define the eat function. I also want to take away a little bit of energy. So the way the energy works is they will lose a little bit of energy no matter what, and then they'll lose more the faster they go. And so their base speed is one of the things that's defined by their genome. If they want to move faster, that is, if that genetic value increases, then they have a higher base speed, they move across the map faster, but they also lose more energy. And it is possible for them to move backwards, and so I need to take the absolute value here. Otherwise, what you would see evolve, and this has happened often in the past, they would evolve to move backwards and gain energy through the process. So we've got to be careful here to take the absolute value. Otherwise, in a sense, they'll trick us. And if you want to see that, remove the absolute and see what happens once we have the evolutionary model running, of course. The other thing I need to do before I forget is we did give them an energy that is part of the creature class, but you can see we don't give them a starting energy. So when we create a new creature, we should give them some amount of energy. And this is a number that you can play with if you want. So now I need to define this sort of eat function for them. And the first thing we need to do is figure out which cell on the map they're in and whether or not there's any food there. So the X and Y position, not of the creature, which is sort of in a more continuous map, but in this grid-based cell. And we do that just by taking the X location and dividing it by the coarseness of our cell scale. So if our cells are 4 by 4, we take the location, divide by 4, and that tells us what cell we're in. And do the same thing for our Y value. And now we just need to check if there's food there. So here I'm checking to see if there's fruit in that cell in the map. I should spell map correctly. And one thing I pointed out in previous videos, we reverse the X and Y because here we're dealing with not the location on the map exactly. We're dealing with our two-dimensional array, and arrays are always row column, and so the Y value is which row we are in the array. So if there is fruit there, then the creature gets energy from that. And the amount of energy they get depends on their genome. So this was in the previous video, but they can evolve to get more energy from fruit or more energy from whatever it is the seaweed in the water is. And those are normalized values. So if they evolve to get more of one energy from one, they'll get less energy from the other, and it forces sort of an evolutionary balance on them. And this value is calculated up here in the calculate values function. So when we first create a creature as part of the constructor, we call calculate values, and that calculates things like what is the base speed, how fast are they in water or land, and also how much energy do they get from fruit and seaweed based on the value in their genome. So they get that much energy from fruit, and then we need to remove that fruit from the map and also remove the scent around it from the map. So change scent is a function that was created in the first video as part of the environment, and it can be used to either add or remove scent from the environment, depending on whether this is a plus or a -1. In this case, we want to remove the scent, so it's a -1. And then we remove the food just by taking the food string and setting it to the null string. And that's all we need to do if there's fruit in a given location. And then we also need to check for seaweed if we're in the water. So I'm just going to copy this code and make a few minor changes. We're checking for seaweed, and it's the energy from seaweed that we worried about. So now when a creature goes over a piece of food, it should gain energy and remove that food from the environment. So let's see how this works. There we go. Should be energy equals 500. And energy from fruit and energy from seaweed, let me double check. Here, it's not from. One of the problems you run into when there's a gap between doing the coding projects. Forget exactly what your variable names are. There we go. So now if we zoom in, we should be able to see, for example, this creature here just ran over some food and it disappeared. Presumably, I can follow it a little further, presumably its energy went up, although I'm not printing that to test it. That would be a good thing to do, but we are successfully removing the food from the environment when creatures run over it, which is a good sign. So now we have creatures that can eat food. The next thing we need to do is to say, well, if they get enough energy, they can reproduce. But also, if you run out of energy, you die. So those are the two next pieces that we need to add. And those will be in sort of the main game loop because they have to look at the whole population. So what I want to do is look at the whole population and see if any of the creatures have enough energy to reproduce. So I'm going to go into my main draw loop and just add a reproduce function, which I then need to define. It's going to go through, as I said, the whole population and check for any creatures whose energy level is above some threshold. And if it's above that threshold, they'll reproduce by basically creating another copy of themselves. So here's the first piece of that. I'm going to go through the whole population, and I'm going to get each creature out of the population and then check that creature's energy and see if it's above, and this is again an arbitrary number, above 1500. So the starting energy is 500, so they have to collect a fair amount before they can reproduce. If they have that much energy, I'll create a new creature. And then for the evolutionary part, what I want to do is copy the genome of the old creature into the new creature. But I haven't defined this copy function yet, so I'm going to put it in as a reminder that I need it, but comment it out for now. And then similarly, I'm going to want to have that new creature, which has just copied over the parent creature's genome, I'm going to want to mutate it so it's a little different from its parent. And this is basically, well, it is asexual reproduction. So I'm not dealing with two parents here. I'm dealing with one parent that when it gets enough energy splits into two. So it's asexual reproduction. Again, I don't have the mutate function defined yet, so I'm going to comment that out for now. And then I just need to do a few other little pieces to make this work well. The parent creature should lose some energy, so I'm going to have it lose 1,000 energy. The offspring, when I create it, as we just saw, starts with 500 energy. So in a sense, the parent gives 500 of its energy to its offspring, and then it also loses another 500 of energy. So the reproductive process in this case is pretty energy intensive, which is not unreasonable biologically speaking. And these are all numbers that you can play with to sort of get different effects. You do have to be very careful to reduce the amount of energy by quite a bit. If you leave this out, as soon as the creature gets enough energy to reproduce, it's just going to continually reproduce, and you'll get an enormous population explosion and your program will probably grind to a halt. There are other ways to handle reproduction. So what I'm not putting in here, for example, is any time limit. It would be not unreasonable to say once you've reproduced, you have to wait a certain amount of time or a certain number of frames before you can reproduce again. So there we can deal with the energy. Another thing that is nice to do is to randomize the heading of the offspring. So you have sort of the parent and then you create an offspring. It's nice for the offspring to be turned in a random direction. Otherwise, they're going to be right on top of each other going in exactly the same direction. You get less interesting effects because now they're sort of immediately competing for all of the food that's in front of them. The other thing I need to do is calculate all of those offspring values. So as I pointed out near the beginning of the video, we create a new creature, and with the copy, it will get all of the genetic values, the gene values of its parents, which will then mutate a little bit. Based on those genetic values, we have to calculate the values for things like how fast does it move in water or on land, how much energy does it get from food, and so forth. So, and then the last thing I do is add the population to the offspring. Add the offspring to the population. And so now, when a creature gets enough energy, it creates an offspring that is added to the population. The other thing I should do, and I talked about this in one of the earlier videos, is check to see if the population has gotten too small. It's very common in evolutionary models that early on the creatures are fairly maladapted and they, in this case, starve to death, and you have a total extinction event, which is not very interesting. And so it's nice to set a minimum population size, which I already have in this code because I set it up that way. So here's the min population. And as part of the reproduction, could be a separate function, but I'll put it in as reproduction. If we drop below that minimum population size, I'll add another creature to the population. There we go. So if the size of the population is below the minimum, create a new creature and just add it to the population. And in this case, I don't need to worry about copying an existing individual or mutating it. It's already going to have a random heading, so I don't have to worry about that. I do need to calculate the values here because in the constructor, we'll calculate the values, but those are for the old gene values before they're mutated. So I get random gene values, I copy the parent, I mutate, and then I have to recalculate those values, even though they were done as part of the constructor. Little bit of code there we got to be careful about. So I don't yet have a way for creatures to die, which is not great, but we can still run this and see if the reproduction works. I'm missing a parenthesis, and this should be pop, not population. Offspring does not need parentheses, and let's see, min pop size is just min pop. There we go. So now we have creatures moving around, eating food, and the possibility of reproduction. We probably won't observe it because it requires collecting a fair amount of food. Wouldn't be a bad idea to go in and add a lot more food and maybe change some of the parameters to make reproduction easier. I'm not going to worry about that, but it is a good way to test the code. What I do want to add next is the idea of starvation. So if they run out of food, they disappear. And so that's going to be another part of the main game loop. So here I have my reproduce operation. I also want to go in and put in a check population to remove anybody whose energy is below 0. And there's one trick here. I'm going to go through the whole population again, removing individuals whose population is less than 0. Because I'm using an array list, I can pull them out of that array list, but I need to go through it starting at the highest value and working backwards. That way, when I remove an individual, I'm not immediately trying to jump into that space in the array list. So this is typical. Removing from an array list, you go through the list backwards. There we go. So we go through the array list, as I said, backwards, starting from the population size -1, because if our population is size 100, they're numbered 0 to 99. Get each one, check its energy. If its energy is less than or equal to 0, remove it from the population. Excellent. So that takes care of our sort of eating, our reproduction, and checking for starvation. The next thing that I want to add is my copy and mutate, because that's going to be important for the evolutionary model. So I'm going to add those functions to my creature class. And notice the way they work. The offspring copy function takes the parent. So it's going to copy the data over from the parent, and then the mutate just mutates those values. So not necessary, but I'm going to put them up here near the constructor so that I can see the values that I need to copy over. So I'm copying from a source creature. So first I want to put it at the same location, so the offspring is at the same location as the parent. And then each of the genetic values for my offspring should be the same as the parent, the source. Next, we'll do the mutation to add some random mutation to those values. The creature object has some other data members like the heading, but I'm going to set that to be random anyways. It has the energy, but I'm going to adjust the energy as part of the reproduction step. So you could copy those other data members, but it's not critical to do. And now we need the mutate. And there are lots of different ways to do mutation. I'm going to pick sort of the simplest, which is pick one of the random gene values and just change it by a little bit. There we go. So pick a random gene and then add a random value. And again, I sort of arbitrarily pick between -0.5 and 0.5. A bigger random range here, you'll get bigger mutations and potentially faster evolution. But it also becomes harder for evolution to sort of fine-tune those values because it's making such large changes. And you can play with that. There's no reason why you couldn't have 2 or 3 genes mutated for each mutation. I'm just having to mutate one at a time. And now I can go back over here and uncomment those. We now have a simple evolutionary model. If we run it though, there is sort of still a pretty significant issue here, which is that all of our creatures only move in a straight line. So built into their genes is an attraction or repulsion based on the scent of food and based on the terrain. So we've got those 2 sensing organs that can or should be able to look ahead and decide whether the creature should turn or not. But that's not part of our update function yet. And so that's the last thing we need to add is when the creatures are updating their position, they need to be able to interact with the environment in order to be able to turn. And as you'll see, that gets a bit complicated in terms of the code. So here is our current update function, and it calculates the speed of the creature. So in fact, it looks at whether it's in the water based on the current altitude of the map and uses the water speed, or if it's on land, it uses the land speed. And then it changes the X and Y position based on that speed and the heading. And then if it reaches the edge of the map, they just bounce off. So instead of wrapping around, they bounce off. And we added the eat function so they can eat food and they lose a little bit of energy. What we now have to add is the ability to sense what's in front of them. And so for that, we're going to need to know where those 2 sensing organs are. And so I'm going to need, as it turns out, a fair number of variables because I need to know the X and Y location of the left sensor and the X and Y location of the right sensor. And then just like we did for food, not only do I need to know the XY position on the map, I also need to know which cell that sensor is in so I can determine if that cell contains water or land or scent that it can then turn based on. So to begin with, I need a fair number of variables to keep track of all of that. So this will be the XY position of the left sensor, and then I'll turn that into the row and column, hence the R and C, so I know which cell that sensor is looking at, and the same thing for the right sensors. And then to figure out where those sensors are, I have to use the genetic values for the length of sort of the antenna, if you will, and the angle of the antenna. So here I'm calculating the angle of, if we want, we can think of it as an antenna, and it is based on the angle gene. So from my mapping, I look up the word angle and it tells me which gene number that is. It turns out to be 0. So from the genome, I get the 0th genetic value. I run it through my sigmoid function, which maps it from -1 to 1, and then rescale it from minus 0.5 pi to 0.5 pi. And that means my antennas can sort of go anywhere from half a pi out to the side or the negative value. So you can also, in a sense, cross your antennas, and what value you get depends on what evolves. And then we're going to do the same sort of thing for the distance, or if you will, the length of the antennas. And in this case, I'm setting the length of the antenna to be at least 3. So I want them to stick out at least a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same sort of thing, missing a parenthesis there. I'm going to use the distance gene. I'm going to run it through the sigmoid to get a value from -1 to 1. I'm going to take the absolute value of that. I don't, in this case, want antennas pointing backwards, although you could remove the absolute value and allow that to happen. And then I'm going to multiply by the scale of the cells. So that is sort of how many cells or how far ahead it looks. And I'm putting in sort of a lot of controls here. And that's so that the evolutionary process gets a little bit of a head start. If you want to think about it this way, I'm cheating a bit so we can see results a little sooner. And you could certainly change those parameters to sort of open up the evolutionary space. It also means that you could get much more interesting results. I mean, maybe there'll be creatures that evolve to have their antennas pointing backwards and they move backwards for some reason. So how you set those limitations affects both how quickly you get results, but also the breadth of the possible results. Now that I know the location of the sensors in the sense of the angle and the length, I can calculate their actual location on the map. Here's the position, the X position for the left sensor. It's the position of the creature, really the center of the creature, plus the length of the antenna times the cosine of not just the angle, but we have to look at the heading of the creature plus the angle. So if the creature is headed in this direction and the antenna is pointed off to the side a little bit, I add those two angles together to figure out the X value that I'm adding in. And once I've done that, I can do the same thing for all of these other sensors. So there we go. And the other difference is the right sensor, we subtract the angle. So one is to the left and one is to the right. Now that we know their positions, I have to figure out what the row and the column should be in order to figure out what cell they're looking in. And here I'm doing the same thing that I did with food. I'm taking the absolute X value, dividing it by the cell scale to figure out what cell I'm in, and turning it into an integer because I want the integer value. And again, which column I'm in depends on the X value. And now I'll just do the same thing for all of the other sensor rows and columns. There we go. And hopefully I have all of that correct. It's always a good idea to double check, because if those are off, Potentially the code will still run, they'll just be doing weird things in terms of where they think they're sensing. One thing that can help here is to draw where those sensors are. And so I am going to include that in the code. There we go. So this is going to draw a line from the center of the creature to where the left and the right sensor should be. And then I'll also draw a little dot at the end, makes it look kind of like eyes. I think that's kind of nice. There we go. Spell circle correctly. So now I at least have the position of the sensors and I'm drawing them to see how they look, so we can try that out. And now if we zoom in, you can see that we have creatures with these little sort of eyes. They're sensors in front of them. So there's some that are sort of widely set, some that are more narrowly set. There's some where the angle is very small. So they're overlapping each other. You'll notice it just starved to death. So we do have our dying if you run out of energy working. So we've got the sensors. Our creatures still aren't turning because they're not actually sensing anything yet. But looks like we've got them in the right position and we know which cell they're looking at. And so now we can start actually having the creatures turn based on them. So we'll do that piece next. The first thing we are going to have to worry about is to make sure that our rows and columns are on the map. So I'm going to have a big if statement to check that those are on the map. I also am going to need a couple more variables just to determine what it is that we're sensing. So let me make a little space here. So these are the variables for scenting food on the left and right, and for sensing the terrain on the left and right. For food, we're going to be comparing the strength of the scent, so that needs to be a floating point value. For the terrain, it's just an integer. Is it water or is it land? And now I have to make sure that we're looking on the map, because as the creatures get very close to the edge, it's possible that those sensing organs or their antennas are poking off the edge of the map, and then we'll get an out of bounds error. Another approach would be to force them to turn around a little sooner so that there's a boundary around the edge. It's not a bad approach, it's just not the one I picked. Let me make this a little larger. So this is my check to make sure the column and the row for the left sensor are on the map, larger than or equal to 0 and less than the width, I should spell that correctly, of the grid and the height of the grid. And then I'll do the same thing for the right sensor. So there's our check to make sure that we're sensing something which is on the map. If either of the sense organs or either of the antennas extend past the map, in this case, it just means we won't do any sensing, and that's okay. The creature will hit the edge of the map, turn around, and then start sensing again. And now we need to find out what is being sensed. So here's the first piece of that. I'm checking the left food scent by looking at the map at the locations of the left sensor and recording how strong is the scent of fruit there, for example. And then I need to do the same thing with the right sensor. So now we, or the creature, if you will, knows how strong the scent of fruit is on the left and on the right, and then based on its gene value, it will turn towards or away from that. So we'll just adjust the heading accordingly. So we get the gene for the fruit turn speed, and I'm again going to run it through a sigmoid to map it from -1 to 1, and then I will adjust that to make it a turn in radians. So the maximum turn is 1/4 of pi, and again, you can adjust this if you want. And then what's in the other piece that's important here is that's based on the difference between those two scents. So if the scent is stronger on one side or the other, it will turn in that direction. And if the scents are exactly equal, the creature doesn't know what to do and it'll just keep going in a straight line because they're exactly equal. This will give us a 0 and the total change in the heading will be 0. So this takes care of our scent and how it responds to fruit. And now I can just copy this and do the same thing for our seaweed. So let me do that. And I'm just going to cut and paste and then replace this with the seaweed. And I want the seaweed turn speed. So now if it senses fruit, it'll turn accordingly. If it's smelling seaweed, it'll turn accordingly. And potentially it may smell some of both if it's right on the shore, for example, and turn towards whichever food it has evolved to have a preference for. Okay, so that takes care of turning towards or away from food. Now we need to do it for terrain, and for terrain I'm going to do a little bit differently because we only need to know what type of terrain is there. So here we go. It's again using the left sensor, but now it's looking at the altitude of the map, and if that's larger than 0, that means we're on land. And so I'm setting the left terrain value to 1, arbitrarily representing land. And if it's less than 0, that would be water. And I arbitrarily set the left terrain to be -1. And now I'm going to do the same thing for the right sensor. So now the left and the right terrain tell us whether there's water or land under those sensors for the creature. So there we go. It's exactly the same sort of heading change based on the land turn speed gene. That is, how fast or how hard does it turn towards or away from land. Running the gene value through a sigmoid to make sure it's mapped from -1 to 1, and then scaling it and so forth. And now we can do the same thing for the water turn speed. And a little bit of a tricky piece here. Arguably, I should put in a minus because water is represented by a -1, and so I want the negative here to cancel out the negative here. You can do that to some extent. It doesn't really matter because on the evolutionary side, it can just evolve a negative genetic value, which, because of the pluses and minuses, might actually mean you turn towards water. This is an important point, and it's one of the things that makes evolutionary models kind of tricky. They're going to evolve based on the rules I put in. If I make a mistake in the rules, they're going to evolve accordingly. And so it often can be hard to tell if I have made some sort of mistake in here in terms of turning towards or away from land, or maybe I got my antennas crossed. Well, if I do, evolution is just going to say evolve accordingly. So it's going to say, well, if there's food over here, I don't turn left even though this is the left antenna. Because they're crossed, it will presumably evolve to turn right instead. So that all gets a little complicated, and it can mean that you have to be very careful about going in and checking your code, or not worry about it, and evolution will sort of figure out what to do based on the mistakes that I made in putting the code together. So I need my final closing bracket to close this if, and possibly everything is correct. I see some errors here on my scent fruit, so that is part of the cell class for my map, and I see that I called it fruit scent and seaweed scent, so reverse the name. There we go. And now let's see what other errors I have. Okay, so here's our model. We've got our creatures moving around again. If we zoom in, we can see some of the characteristics of them. So you'll notice now we've got creatures that are not just moving ahead, they're doing weird motions. So this actually looks like a pretty good one. It is turning towards food, rapidly gathering up seaweed. There's another one that's doing some weird turning motions, but this one, for example, is not. And that makes sense, right? We've got all random initial values. There's a creature that's base speed apparently is backwards. So it is moving backwards. The other thing we put in an earlier video is the color is based on what they get the most energy from. So in fact, these red creatures get the most energy by eating fruit, whereas the greener creatures get the most energy by eating seaweed. So these red creatures that are so good, oh, that one starved to death, just as I pointed at it, probably because it doesn't get a lot of energy from seaweed. So it's still kind of maladapted. But you can see a wide range of behaviors taking place. And here's another interesting creature. It's having trouble focusing on food, but at least it's responding to it. So we do have behaviors that respond to what is on the map in terms of the food, and also potentially, although we'd have to find one to look at, responding when they get near the water or the land. So in fact, that you can see sort of turned a bit to be more near the land. I talked about this in one of the earlier videos, but it's worth mentioning again now that everything is evolving. What we have here is what's known as epistasis. The value of a particular gene or a particular trait is hard to judge by itself. For example, having a tail that makes you more faster and more efficient in the water is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing by itself. Having a tail that makes you faster in the water is a good thing if you also turn towards seaweed and get a lot of energy from seaweed and turn to stay in the water. Having a big tail that makes you fast in the water but slow on land isn't much good if you immediately run onto the land and slow down, and in this case, starve to death. So I've intentionally made a somewhat complicated evolutionary model where there are lots of traits that have to co-evolve in order to get well-adapted creatures. And looks like I've talked long enough that we've gotten some. So you'll notice this one is doing a good job of turning towards food and apparently turning away from the land. It's green, which means it gets a lot of energy from the seaweed. It does sometimes get stuck on land anyway. And it has a tail, so it's relatively fast in the water. Not perfectly adapted, it still has some trouble moving around, but it's doing a pretty good job, and I suspect if we watch it long enough, there we go, we get to see it reproduce. And so now we've got two versions of it, slightly different because of the mutation. Here we'll notice some other creatures that have started to evolve. They have a very different body shape, but they're also green, so well adapted to eating seaweed and pretty well adapted, it looks like, to picking them up. I don't see a tail on them, so maybe not all that fast in the water, but it still looks like they're being reasonably successful. We see a lot of them have already evolved, relatively speaking. And if I zoom out, you can maybe see even sort of different populations of creatures. So here's a bunch of these sort of thin ones with the wide spaced sensors. Here's some of those more round ones with the tails, not so good at finding food, right? You can see them sort of getting all confused in here, but not terrible at it either. This particular map has a lot of water, but yeah, we can see over on land, here are some red creatures that have maybe evolved to be on land. In this case, evolution has actually happened relatively quickly because I intentionally tweaked the values a bit to help that along in terms of where the sensor is located, for example, making sure that the length of the sensors was 3+. So you could go in and play with those values if you wanted. Okay, and then the last thing that I want to point out, of course, is there's an almost infinite, I suppose there really is an infinite number of changes that could be made to this. So obvious ones are more different appendages so that they can move in different terrain. So all I have is water and land. We could add some different terrain types, some different appendages, some more types of food. They don't interact with each other, so definitely a limitation is they can sense food and they can sense what terrain they're near. They can't actually sense each other, so we could add the ability to sense other creatures. Maybe each creature has a little scent cloud around it as it moves, and then they can evolve predation behaviors where they, instead of picking up our fruit and seaweed, they chase down other creatures. Right, so there's a couple of variations. You could set it up so that the food itself evolves. Right now, the food sources are pretty boring. They just get added randomly every time tick another piece of food gets put down. Instead, you could add genomes to your food so the food could evolve in some complicated way. Right? So there's just a few different things that you could add. As I said, this is really a very simple evolutionary model and a very simple environment. And I wanted to do that on purpose to sort of keep the length of the videos under control. Hopefully from here, you can take it in all sorts of different directions. And if you get any exciting or interesting results, definitely put a comment down below. Thank you.